Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. And another all-star guest is joining me today here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. He is the co-host of the Positivity Chat. Every week, he and Karen Markle, who is also a guest, has been a guest on the Intentional Encourager podcast. And I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode with Karen. But every week, he and Karen co-host the Positivity Chat, and it's a great conversation. You can find information on that on LinkedIn. Just search Positivity Chat, and Steve will be telling you more about that. He is also a certified UMAP coach. So again, our good friend Kristen Sherry, another guest on the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that as well. And he is just into a lot of things. He talks about confidence and coaches people on confidence. But today we're going to talk encouragement specifically, and that is my good friend, Steve Sullivan, who joins me on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Steve, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thank you for having me on your show. So I hope I can share wisdom today.
Well, listen, if wisdom is shared, it will be from you, because there's not much here that people get wisdom from.
Hey, buddy, you need to be more intentional about encouraging yourself.
Oh, I am. I'm just self-deprecating. I'm intentional about self-deprecation because here's the thing. And Steve, we'll start there because I think it's important, because we have so many people in our world that are trying to fit a certain image. They're trying to fit a certain persona. Every picture on Instagram just has to be perfect, or every post just has to be because they have an image to uphold and protect. I'm not that way. I would rather be self-deprecating and lend to humor than to think that I'm something and I'm not, because the Bible says that he who thinketh himself to be something when he is nothing deceiveth himself. And so I don't want to deceive. Not only do I not want to deceive myself, but I don't want to deceive others. When you meet people that you come in contact with that have an image problem, in other words, they may not be portraying who they really are, what's your first piece of advice to them?
My first piece of advice is for them to learn about their strengths and focus upon what is right with them, so that they can gain confidence in who they are and in their uniqueness. You know, a lot of people who fail to have confidence are caught up in this mode of, I'm not good enough for this, I'm not good enough for that. And when I coach people, I don't want to hear about what they think is wrong with them. Mm-hmm. I want to hear about what is right. And I want to lead them through a UMAP process to understand what is right about them, so that they can gain that confidence to live in their power and make themselves, better at public speaking, or in meetings at work, or on an interview for a new job.
Yeah. And that's so important, because everybody feels like, and I've been in these situations, you're interviewing for a position, Steve, and you feel like, do I have the right tie on? Do I have is my shirt nice and pressed? Is my suit looking good? And how about my shoes? What about my hair, my teeth? Everything on the outside has to be perfect. But a lot of times, you said that so well, it's the internal deficiencies that end up coming out in a job interview. It's nothing external. It's just that we don't have that confidence in ourselves to be able to go, here's what I know, here's what I can do, and here's what I bring to the table. How hard is it for people to really, for you, how hard is it to coach people to their strengths and not always trying to make excuses for their deficiencies?
Actually, it's fairly easy. Once they go through the process of identifying their top 5 strengths, and we drill down on what value comes with each of those strengths, then it's easy for me to say to them, tell me about a story that demonstrates that strength. And for example, they might be an achiever. Achievers are very goal oriented. And so they might have a story around how they set out goals on a weekly, monthly process to complete this project successfully on budget, on time. Now they have a story that they can bring into an interview and impress the interview people that this person knows what they're doing and has value to give to that organization.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, I got to ask you this, because there's so many things that draw people to different things that they pursue. Our mutual friend, as I mentioned off the top of the broadcast, Kristen Sherry, a marvelous lady. I love Kristen. She's so good. She was kind to me and came into my life at a time that I really needed somebody like her. What was it about the UMAP program that intrigued you so much that you said, I've got to be a part of this, but not just be a part of it, but coach the UMAP system?
Well, the journey there started with actually Lila Smith reaching out to me. She's a UMAP coach.
Mm-hmm.
She had seen some of my posts on LinkedIn about trying to find a job. And she was a fairly new, I think, coach at that time. And so she sent me a copy of UMAP free of charge and said, Steve, read this and then we'll talk. And so I started to do what we call DIY process of using the book and working through the assessments. And as I did that and I started to see things and learn things, I realized I had questions around some of it and I needed to talk to people. And so Lila connected me with Lori Knudsen, who's another UMAP coach. And Lori was a great help to me personally in answering some of those questions.
And also another guest of the Intentional Encourager podcast.
Yes, we have a big circle.
Mm-hmm.
And so having come to realize the insights that can be gained through the discovery process in terms of what you can do with it in growing in your career and also growing in relationships, because a lot of the insights apply not just at work, they apply at home. And at that juncture, the idea of becoming a UMAP coach became appealing to me. Kristen Cherry reached out to me. I got on board. She was awesome and very generous with her time to get me trained. And so for about a year plus or so, I've been a UMAP coach working with people and helping them understand what's unique about them.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, that's the thing is, a lot of people don't know what they don't know. It's human nature, right? We say, well, and I'll give you a good example. I'm working on my first book now, and I thought, okay, I've got it. Until I got with a coach who does this for a living and said, you need to edit that thing. You need to cut it in half. And so I'm in the process of the edit right now, and I probably have to do a second edit. But again, you don't know what you don't know. And so, for people out there that may hear this conversation, what was it about yourself that you found out in the process of becoming a UMAP certified coach that you went, that's a V8 moment. I didn't realize this about myself.
I realized that I was a lot more social than what I expected, because if you were to go back with me 5 years and ask, I'd probably tell you I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert. But most of the people that know me on LinkedIn probably think of me as an extrovert. And what's coming through is, again, me utilizing my connectedness strength to connect effectively and network with people and bring people together so that as unique people, they may complement each other and then create a greater success.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was there, but also in the personal side of it. You know, all of us that are married who've gone through this have seen insights that have helped us out. For example, when I took my wife through it, I found out she's very much a inward facing person. There's strengths that are called inward facing, and there's strengths that are called outward facing or people facing. And my wife is very much the inward facing person. And over our 26 years, numerous times I've tried to get her to go out and network with me, and it's like pulling the teeth. You know, she doesn't want to do it. She fights it.
Yeah.
And usually I have one certain times, and then she says, "Yeah, I had a good time." And then my default answer in the future was always, "You know, if you come, you're going to have a good time."
Mm-hmm.
Well, I realized that contention was happening because she's not that way. She doesn't want to be out with people where I do. And so we've had to come to a place of agreement and acceptance of, okay, I'm going to go do all my LinkedIn meetings and things and have, you know, all these great friendships and connections, and she doesn't mind. And I leave her at home to do what she wants to focus on and grow in the ways that she wants to grow.
I've got to ask you this because in your background, you have a strong background in healthcare as I do. I've been in the healthcare field for a number of years now, and we are seeing some unusual, unprecedented times for people in the healthcare field with COVID-19 and things like that. The reason that I'm going here is that the challenges are either temporary or it seems like they're more permanent. What do you see coming from this pandemic that you think, okay, this may be here for a good while and this may be the new normal? Because what I see the way that people go to the hospital or go to the doctor. They may not be as forthcoming in going to the doctor or going and getting something done as they would have been before. What do you see, Steve? And again, I want to tap into that wealth of expertise there that you have.
Well, you're also tapping into one of my strengths with this, which is the context strength. I love history. I love looking at the past to try and figure out how we got to where we are today from the past and what lessons can we learn from that. And the whole idea of are we in this permanent state of COVID? I don't buy, because if you go back to the 1918 Spanish flu, a lot of the same things happened there with people closing schools, with movie theaters closed. There was a shutdown and people hunkered down for pretty much 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But once the virus had run its course, people started to live again. We are social beings naturally. So give us the opportunity to get out and socialize, and we will. So I see this as a passing thing. One of the things that may occur out of this, and I'm glad to see it, is more of a greater appreciation of people who work remotely, and understanding that if somebody's working at home, they can actually do a good job from home.
It's a great point.
I actually, long before COVID, moved a team of IT people into a work from home relationship. But I got a lot of flack from the organization, from other managers saying, how do you know they're working? There was always this undercurrent of suspicion that they would be goofing off instead of working. Well, I put some KPIs in place. I put some things in place that allowed me to monitor their productivity. And what I saw was an increase in productivity. And oftentimes to these same doubters, I'd say, how do you know your staff are working in their cubes?
Mm-hmm.
Just because they're here.
And Steve, I want to jump in here just a second. Yeah. One of the best lessons that I learned about that, I learned early in my career. So I was 22 when I started in sales. I was just about to turn 23. And I remember one day my boss was an older gentleman. He was easily 30, 35 years older than me, but we had a wonderful relationship. And he looked at me one day and he said, Brian, I don't care if you work from 10 to 2 every day as long as you hit your numbers. What he was instilling in me, Steve, was it's production. That's the key. That's the KPI that matters, right? At the end of the day, what we end up producing, whether it takes us 8 hours to do it or an hour, it reminds me of the parable in the Bible of the vineyard where Jesus was teaching, and he was telling the story that a man contracted with workers, and he said, I will pay you a penny. And he hired some early in the day. He hired some in the middle of the day, and he hired some late in the day. But at the end, everybody got the same wage, and people were mad. And the story goes that the man that ran the vineyard said to them, did I not agree with you for a penny? You agreed to work at the time I hired you for a penny. It's mine to do with what I want to do with it. And the point being, Steve, is whether production happens at from 8 to noon, or from noon to 4, or from 4 to 10. Some people work better in the evenings. Some people are more productive. Some people are early morning people. I love what you said there, because it must have taken. Tell me about the inspiration behind that, because that was forward thinking in a time where, to your point, a lot of people didn't want to have remote employees.
Yeah, the truth is it was a practical ramification. As the IT team grew, they were looking for space in the data center where my team was at. And so I volunteered to say, hey, I can take my team out of here, have them work from home, because all they need is access to the servers. That's their job all day long.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was some questions and conversations around that. Ultimately, I had to work with HR and set up some agreements that I had each team member sign. I put KPIs in place. I did a lot of things that I probably should have done before I even took them home. I probably should have been doing these things for years. And it's just the fact that moving home forced me to think, this is the time to put this in place. So I made changes, and it was successful under my leadership. But once I was out of that situation, the new manager that came in pulled them all back in house.
Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, it is getting and having the right people on the bus and getting the wrong people off the bus. Because if you're going to for a quote, you're going to ride or die with those people.
Yes.
And there better be that high degree of trust there. Steve, one more question around this, and then we'll pivot to telling your story, your incredible, wonderful story. But what is the biggest lesson that you have learned right now around this COVID-19 pandemic?
That probably, as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. Disease comes and goes. What's strange today is we are responding to disease differently than we ever have.
Mm-hmm.
We've taken some of the lessons that have been learned, like, hey, separate away from sick people so that the sickness doesn't spread, and now have turned it into this everybody's at home all the time, and a fear of letting people come back and be together again because they may get the disease. But the reality is, you'll hear all these things about a vaccine. I personally, again, looking at history, can tell you the fastest vaccine to market took 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical that they're going to have one out in 21. And by 2022, we will have created the herd immunity in the process. The vaccine won't be needed as much, and it'll become just a part of like the standard flu vaccine that people get every year.
That's a great point. And Steve, the thing that has intrigued me about this whole thing, and I'll jump in here with this for a minute, is and you know the products that I'm going to speak on very well from the IT side. But everybody talks about Bill Gates and his jumping into this vaccine. And what I've said is, listen, as intelligent as Bill Gates is, he does not know the hurdles he will have to clear with the Food and Drug Administration, with insurance companies, with providers, medical providers who will have to prescribe this vaccine initially. You know, as smart as Bill Gates is, he doesn't know this industry.
He hasn't been down that path.
Yeah, he hasn't been down that road. You're 100% right. And so to me, that gives me pause when someone, hey, listen, it's hard enough to get Windows to work consistently, let alone that he's going to try to develop a vaccine, you know?
I got you. But, you know, one of my biggest fears is that greed will get in the way of proper testing.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're seeing that in Russia as they claim to have a vaccine, which they basically have rushed to the market. And I think their hope is if they can convince other people, they'll sell a bunch of vaccines.
Yeah.
We need to realize there's a process to develop vaccines that are helpful and not hurtful.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. That's a really good point. Let's transition now to your story because and again, I want you to take me as far back as you want to take me in your story, because what I have found recording nearly 50 of these podcasts that I've done is that everybody's story is unique, but there are moments in people's lives that just they tell the story and the hair stands up on the back of my neck because it's like, wow, that's powerful. Take me through your story and start as far back as you want to go and take me through your story.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Now, I often tell people that I'm on my 4th life, and that represents the number of health issues and other things that I've gone through which could have killed me. And I can go back to being a recent college graduate, newly married with 2 little boys, basically the age of 23. And, you know, I heard the 3 words nobody wants to hear. I heard the 3 words that no doctor wants to say. You have cancer. And on that day, it hit me that, you know, I was diagnosed with leukemia. And while I was laying in the hospital bed, I thought, this is it. I'm going to die. Maybe not today, maybe in 2 years, but the survival rates for leukemia are not very high. Back when I was diagnosed, it was only about like 22% had a 5-year chance to still be alive. And so I then quickly turned from that realization to the realization of, hey, I have a wife and 2 little boys. Who's going to take care of my wife? Who's going to raise my sons? And they became motivation for me to live as full a life as I could for however long I had. And I mentally came up with this mindset that I call embrace today. And there's 3 parts to that. One is being aware of the world around you and appreciating it. It might be an act of kindness. It might be a flower next to a sidewalk. It might be a bird singing in a tree. But those opportunities are there for us to hear and gain peace and appreciate something.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing was to make memories with others, family, friends, because there's in every day, you know, I would wake up and wonder if this is my last day.
And Steve, let me jump in here because I've got to ask I've really got to ask a follow-up question there. How long did it take you to develop that? Was it something that came to you pretty instantaneously and you said, hey, tomorrow morning, these three things I'm going to be intentional about doing? Or was it more of a process of figuring these three steps out to embracing that, developing that mindset?
It happened fairly quickly for me, certainly during my first hospital stay, which was a total of 4 weeks. But once I realized that I only had today, I wanted to make the most of it. And so then I thought about how can I make the most of it? And I realized again that there's so much beauty around me that I can appreciate, that there's people that I can do things with to make memories for today. And in some cases, like with my 2 little boys, I knew that they probably wouldn't remember, but the memories were important to me. They encouraged me, and they encouraged my wife. And the third thing then is to love those that you care about, to let them know that they are cared for and loved. Because you don't know if this will be your last day, and you
So
don't
true.
want to go out saying, oh, I wish I had called my mom and said I love you, or I wish I'd done this. And loving my family was really critical and brought a lot of strength to me. And as I've applied this through my life, I ultimately had 4 children. At that time, I had 2 little boys, and then later I had two more children, a son and a daughter. And just this last year, my daughter honored me by saying to me, Dad, there's never been a moment when I questioned your love for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I try to show that so often, so regularly, that my children, my wife know that I love them.
Wow, that is so good. Let me ask you this. You're 23 years old. Your doctor tells you you've got leukemia. Do you ever wonder why now and not later? Because again, when we're 23 years old, we just graduated college, and I know what I was doing. I didn't get married till the next year when I was 24, but if I had gotten that kind of news that early in life, certainly I wouldn't know how to process it nearly like I do now at 48. Now you've got the wisdom of maturity, and you say, okay, I'm going to take tactical steps to do that. I'm going to try to push the emotion back as much. But I remember what I was like at 23. I was way more emotional than I was tactical. How did you find a balance and say to yourself, okay, Steve, this is what we've got to do? Because it's very tactical to develop the embrace today mindset.
Yes.
And so how did you tap in to that strategic part of you in battling that disease and developing that mindset?
In many ways, I have to give, praise to God and His grace in my life, because I embarked on this journey as a follower and believer of Jesus Christ. And I never really wrestled with the question, why me? Because as I saw things in the world. I came from a medical family, so I was very exposed to disease in the world and different things. I realized, why not me?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it happens to people. Am I special in some way that I shouldn't have it? No.
It rains on the just and the unjust, the Bible says.
Yes, exactly. And so I didn't struggle with that. So that helped me get beyond that really quickly and get to a place of acceptance. I mean, when you can accept something, you can then become practical to take steps. And, to continue on in this story, I went through the standard treatment. A year, things were looking good. I was classified as remission. A year after that, I relapsed. And when you relapse with leukemia, boy, your survival rates take a plummet. In fact, in the hospital, the doctors told me, Steve, you'll be fortunate to be alive in a year. You have a less than probably 5% chance to be alive in a year. And, at that time, I just said thank you to them for being honest with me and giving me their professional advice. But I also told them, there's no such thing as 5% living. You're either 100% live or you're 100% dead. And right now I'm 100% live, and I'll stay that way for as long as God wants.
There was never a thought in your mind, though, Steve, of quote unquote getting your house in order, because again, I would have to think the natural tendency, and I wanted to pop in there. The natural tendency is you beat it once and it relapses, and you go, "Oh man, is this the one that it comes back stronger? Is this going to take me out?" There was never a thought in your mind of getting your house in order. It was full speed ahead for you, right?
Not really. There was a sense of wisdom saying, hey, I need to be prepared. So getting a will together, getting, powers of attorney ready for my wife, so that, the transition and my death to her would be a lot easier financially than if I just pass away.
Mm-hmm.
So there are practical elements of getting your house in order that you can do out of wisdom, whether you're battling cancer or not battling cancer. Some of us just put it off longer than others because we don't feel any threat.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as that threat's there, then yeah, you start taking actions. And I certainly did from that standpoint. But, at that time when I got the word that I had relapsed, I questioned even going back for treatment. I thought, I can go back to treatment. I don't know if it'll work or not. Maybe I'm better off living out my days as best as I can versus, in a sense, rolling the chips on the table and going to the hospital and undergoing treatment that's not exactly fun to undergo. You're taking a gamble in that sense that you're going to come out of that and maybe have more life. But there is a cost to that.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian, it was only through prayer and a sense that God told me, go get this treatment.
Wow.
And
wow.
so then I called up my doctor. We went off to the hospital, and they gave me a new chemotherapy, which was stronger and harder. And I came out of that in remission after one treatment. And at that time, they were encouraging me to go do a bone marrow transplant. That's pretty standard today to say, go do a bone marrow transplant. Back then, the only options I had for me was either an autologous transplant where they take your bone marrow out, zap your body maybe with radiation and kill everything, so to speak, and then put your bone marrow back in. The pros of it is you don't have any rejection of the bone marrow because it's your bone marrow. The cons of it are, because it's your bone marrow and that's where the disease is at, you may get the disease again.
And you're stripping, if I understand it correctly, Steve, you're basically stripping your body down to almost zero.
They kill it off in a transplant standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're banking on the fact that getting the good marrow back in there is going to jumpstart everything and kind of level set. Is that the?
That's the process. And if it's your marrow, it happens. You know, there's not going to be any bone marrow rejection. So you don't have that situation. But you know, being from a medical family, my father had access to medical libraries. There was no Google back then, so I couldn't Google up and say, let me know about the studies related to leukemia. He pulled them, I read them, and as I read them, I saw that autologous treatments often became a multiple bone marrow transplant process. People would relapse and they'd have another one, and within 36 months, they typically were dead. Autologous works great for things like women battling breast cancer, but for leukemia, that's a different story. The other option I had for me was siblings. I have an older sister, and she was tested for compatibility. And back then they looked at 5 markers in the blood for compatibility. Today they look at a minimum of 6 to 8. But she matched on 3 of the 5. So they called her a secondary match. And I talked to the experts about that. And they were like, yeah, come to us, we'll help you. You know, it's your only chance, take it. But as I researched the probabilities of bone marrow rejection, I saw that it was high. And then as I read about bone marrow, rejection and what people go through, I mean, their bodies just go into like inflamed. There's a lot of pain and suffering before they pass. So that wasn't exactly a exciting course to try and take. And ultimately, you know, God giving me grace and kind of being my own advocate in the situation, I decided to ask the experts. I had 2 experts, one an autologist, one a secondary match. I asked the autologist doctor what he thought of the secondary match. And he told me he wouldn't do it, but the bone marrow rejection was too high. So then I talked to the secondary match guy and I said, what do you think of an autologous transplant? And he said, I wouldn't do it because you're probably going to relapse.
Wow. So here you're trying to get the best answer and nobody's giving you a good, solid answer, Steve.
They're giving me the answers that I saw in the research. So they confirmed for me what I was able to find out on my own. And so then I told my doctor, or I went back to my doctor and asked him, you know, if I go through this bone marrow transplant and survive 5 years, which are you going to point to, the bone marrow transplant or the chemotherapy that got me into remission before the bone marrow transplant? Because they want you in remission before they do a transplant. And he said they didn't know. All I knew is that chemotherapy had a small chance of success.
Steve, so, how much input and wisdom did you seek from your dad? Because you mentioned that your dad had a strong medical background. Were you leaning on him pretty heavy? Were you guys having these conversations and he would say, hey, I found this and this may be something to consider? How important was your dad through this process?
My dad was very supportive. He did not through the process, it was pretty much me coming to my own conclusions. And my dad didn't try and influence my own conclusions. He just tried to be a support from the standpoint of what more information could he gather to give to me, because he knew it was ultimately my decision to make. And they supported me in the decision I made. You know, they saw how I logically came to the conclusion I did, and chose not to go forward with a bone marrow transplant, to rest on the last treatment for remission. And I'm still alive today, 30 years later. So, you know, if you look at from hindsight, people could say, well, you made the right decision. The reality is, during that period of time, when I made that decision, I had to come to terms with the fact that I was willing to make that decision, right or wrong, life or death, and stand by that decision. And sometimes, you know, in business, we have to make those decisions that force us, right or wrong, to go forward, and maybe we gain success or maybe we actually fail. But you can't be afraid to make that decision. And by God's grace, I wasn't.
What was the greatest lesson that cancer taught you or leukemia taught you about yourself? Because the reason I ask that question is that obstacles in life leave lessons, because we talked about the value of history earlier.
Yeah,
Those
and
obstacles leave lessons that we can go back and glean from. What did cancer teach you?
primarily, again, that first lesson of embrace today, because by just learning to live fully for one day, I became convinced that I would rather live one day than 1,000 so-so days. So if I could live fully for one day, that was good enough, whether I got another day or not. So coming to that mindset was a big help. And then again, as I just mentioned in the story, becoming my own advocate. You know, I often talk to patients and say, be your own advocate. Understand your disease, interact with your physicians, be a part of the decision-making process with them. And so that's life. You know, when we're working with people, we need to be a part of the decision-making process and not be afraid to voice our opinion and, you know, give our thoughts on a situation. You know, those are two of the primary ones. There were definitely others through the cancer treatment, but like you said, every difficult thing I've been through, I can look back and be thankful for, because it taught me lessons that I would not have learned otherwise. Mm-hmm. The only way to learn those lessons was for God to take me through that. And so he put me in a very unique school, not one that I would encourage too many people to follow my footsteps.
Yeah, you can't buy a T-shirt that says alumni of this school of
cancer,
you know, life, or school of cancer. Yeah,
exactly. But again, every rough situation that we go through as individuals, if you're looking for what you can learn from it, mm-hmm. eventually you'll find lessons that you can be thankful and say, I'm thankful for this hurt, this damage, whatever it was, because without it, I would not have learned these valuable lessons.
Yeah. And Steve, that's the thing is that in life, God takes us through things not to punish us, but to teach us. And what I've learned is this, you know, in walking a road of losing my dad real suddenly almost 8 years ago, mm-hmm. you know, walking through a job loss 3 years ago that was just immediate and sudden. You know, what I learned was the things that I gleaned from it, I'm able to help somebody else.
Yes.
I'm able to, when somebody goes through that and people have gone through that, I'm able to help them through that. Steve, was there another obstacle that you overcame in life that you learned another powerful lesson from? Because it would be enough for me to park on it and say, okay, this is how Steve overcame cancer. I've got a sense that there's another lesson and another obstacle.
There are more lessons learned. Certainly one of them that came out of the cancer situation was basically the destruction of my family. I wanted to survive for my family, yet my wife at that time heard what the doctor said, prepare for his death. She sought support elsewhere and unfortunately ended up in an inappropriate relationship, which ultimately led to the demise of our marriage and our family. And that put me into the darkest part that I've ever been in my life, Brian. Cancer is like of the flesh, but the mind, the pains of the heart and the mind are a lot more difficult to deal with. And, during that period, I found myself wrestling with dark thoughts. It was like all these dark thoughts were coming into my mind, things like to kill myself, to kill him, to kill her, or go out and get drunk and try and wash away my problems. All of those thoughts came to me. I didn't act on any of them, but it was a battle of spiritual warfare from a Christian standpoint. And God swept it aside, Brian. I was in church one day, and the pastor, he knew about my life, my situation. He visited me in the hospital. And he was talking about the time when Saul cornered David in the cave. And David snuck up, cut off a little piece of his robe. And then when Saul left, he went out and said, hey, I'm here, and I could have killed you, but I didn't, basically. And Saul repented. David continued to live on.
And the powerful part of that is, too, I want to add some clarity to that. Not only did Saul repent, but David also basically warned the men that were with him and said, Saul is the anointed of God. Do not, if any of you touch the anointed of God, something bad's going to happen to you. Even though Saul was trying to kill David, David still respected the anointing that God had placed on him. He still respected that and threatened anybody that would come near it. So, yeah, that showed not only David's grace in that situation, but his understanding that if I would have carried this out, there would have been far worse that would have come upon me.
Exactly. Now, in terms of the sermon, the guy was drawing, his point that he was drawing from that was that God was not done with David, that he still had plans for David.
That's a great point, Steve.
And as he made that point, he turned in the crowd, he looked at me and he pointed and he said, Steve, I know that God is not done with you yet. I've never had that happen in my life except that one time. But as soon as he pronounced that, those dark thoughts were just blown aside. They were gone. And I went forward out of that. And one of the most powerful lessons I learned from that is forgiveness. As much animosity as I could have had for my wife, for her betrayal and all the hurt that was there, because she was like my helpmate through all my sickness. She was there nursing me, taking care of me. We had a great relationship, and then boom, it's gone. I realized that the path to healing was through forgiveness. And as I came to the point of forgiving her, now forgiveness is not forgetting, forgiveness is accepting what was done, acknowledging your pain, and then choosing to pardon that person. And once I did that, that freed me up to look forward and to start taking steps forward instead of being caught up in this endless current negativity that was going on in my life.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's so powerful because, you know, you're walking through this terrible health situation, which alone is its own obstacle. And now for a West Virginia term, you add gas to the fire. And then realizing that both situations can be taken care of through forgiveness. That's powerful. That is so powerful. As you, man, I've got to go here. I can't leave it because it'd be so easy to go, well, let's move to the last thing. I can't do it because, Steve, when you think back now, almost 30 years later, if you had a chance now to minister to Steve Sullivan, then what would you have said to him? How would you have put your arm around him and encouraged him?
That's an excellent question. And what I would do is what I tell people to do today is to be there in presence. Because a lot of people tried to minister to me during that time. And I can tell you all the trite things I heard. I remember getting a book that said something like, you know, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And I immediately threw it in the trash. Like, this guy obviously has not been through cancer. He doesn't know what really tough things are in life.
Mm-hmm.
And as I came through that, I realized the times that had the greatest impact are when people would just come and sit. They wouldn't say anything. They would just say, I'm going to be there in presence to let you know that you're not alone and that you're cared for. And if I felt like it, I might talk to them. If I didn't feel like it, because oftentimes as a cancer person, you're so sick, you don't feel like talking. And the worst thing you can do is visit somebody in that state and try and force them to talk.
Mm-hmm.
But what you can do is you can visit that person and just sit there and hold their hand or put your arm around them and in silence share the moment in presence.
Wow. That is so good. Steve, we could go for hours telling
You've only got half my story.
telling your story. Well, we need to do another Intentional Encourager podcast for the other part of your story because it's I don't feel like we've scratched the surface, and I want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time.
Mm-hmm.
But Steve, take me through your biggest piece of intentional encouragement right now for folks either walking through a health scare, you've been there, walking through a, man, I don't know how much longer I can continue to work from home. You've been there. Tapping into your strength. You can really hit a lot of areas I believe that people are walking through right now. What's your biggest piece of intentional encouragement?
It comes back to the idea of to embrace today. Don't worry about tomorrow and all those things. Those are fears that steal joy. But if you can stop and enjoy the moment, if you can make a memory and enjoy making that memory, if you can hug your child and enjoy hugging your child, that can bring so much more meaning to your life, whether you're here another 30 years like me or you're gone in a week. So I would definitely encourage people along those lines for sure.
Wow. Steve Sullivan, this has been incredible conversation, and I'm grateful not only for our friendship, but I'm grateful that you chose this platform to share your story, because I had an idea when we got started with this podcast, and you've taken us to some different areas, but I'm grateful. Go to go to his website. It's stephenlsullivan.fyi.to/Stephen-Sullivan. I'll put that in the show notes. Find him on LinkedIn at Steve Sullivan. Also, check out their YouTube channel with the positivity chat that he and Karen Markle do, and they do such an incredible job. Steve, again, we need to do this again sometime. We will do another Intentional Encourager podcast to continue the story, but you have been so gracious with your time today and sharing your story. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
You're welcome, Brian, and thank you for having me as a guest. I always enjoy interacting with hosts and with their audiences.
Even guys like me.
Yeah, even guys like you and me.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through His Word. And until next time, remember, everyone, everywhere, at any time, and any place can be an intentional